jam-packed schedule, so we totally acknowledge that we won't get to have the kind of robust, in-depth discussion that is probably warranted on this subject, and we hope that this is an area we'll come back to again in the future with all of you. We'll have a couple of presentations. The report authors will discuss some of the key points from the research, and then we'll have some panel discussion and Q&A, and I'll introduce our various speakers as we go along. So on that note, I'd love to hand over to our fairly new, I think we can still say you're new, Dom. So Dom Rowe is our CEO at Homelessness New South Wales. Over to you, Dom. And you're muted.
I'm so new that I still can't work the mute button. Welcome. Thanks, Kate, for that. I just want to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm very thankful to be on this land and understand that it's stolen land and always has been, always will be Aboriginal land. So today I wanted to talk to you about a few things, and I'll keep it relatively brief. We are talking about temporary accommodation today, and we know that it plays a vital role in giving people safe shelter, and often it's on the worst days of their lives. And although it's not intended to be a solution to homelessness, we know that an effective temporary accommodation system can do some important things. Firstly, it gives people immediate access to safe accommodation when they really need it, and it will offer a moment of stability and calm and connection so that they can access the supports they need to transition to longer-term housing. And at Homelessness New South Wales, we've been hearing for many years, as you would have been speaking about this yourselves, that from homelessness service providers and for people with lived experience of homelessness, that the temporary accommodation system is just failing. Recent data that was released this week said that 1 in 2 people who needed emergency accommodation just couldn't get it. And that's a really shocking figure. That's really tough for those of you working on the front lines and wanting to provide that support, that you're having to turn away so many people that really need supports and a safe shelter. So our study looked at service providers' views on temporary accommodation, and I want to acknowledge Y Foundations and Domestic Violence New South Wales, who helped us design the survey and distribute that across the sector. And we're also incredibly grateful to the many of you who completed that survey, gave your time to give feedback to the interim findings, and who shared your wisdom and experiences with us. You really strengthened the community and made this piece of advocacy a lot better than it might have been without your involvement. And I think we need to recognise that this year there's actually been some good progress. We're not all the way there. In fact, we're a long way from that, but we've had some progress. So in July, a number of changes were announced. So that was the removal of the limit on available temporary accommodation days. Thankfully, a freeze on the rental seeker diaries, although we understand there's still some issues around that, an increase on the asset cap for everyone, and importantly, a removal of the asset cap for people escaping domestic violence. So these were good reforms, and we know that some of the implementation of those reforms has been a bit of a challenge that DCJ is working on, but at least those reforms took place. And importantly, we know that there's a lot more to be done. But today I'm very proud to launch this report, and it's a stepping stone towards the bigger and more important long-term reforms. So that means more temporary accommodation options, making sure that the temporary accommodation that's available is safe and accessible so you can feel confident in using those services. We want to make sure that there's individualised support for everyone in temporary accommodation who wants and needs that support. And most importantly, in the long term, we need proper long-term housing solutions with proper pathways out of crisis for people and into a home, a safe, secure and affordable home. So today, I just want to thank you for joining us today and to congratulate you, because if you're here with us today, it means you're interested in being a part of a solution for a better temporary accommodation system that we so urgently need. And we're going to look forward working together with you on that challenge, because together we think we can get even bigger and even better reforms to this system. So thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much, Dom. And our friends and colleagues from Domestic Violence New South Wales, who have been a really important part of this study and an important part of all the work we do, couldn't join us today. But Andrea Carwell has got a video message to share with us. We want to play that now.
Sorry to see you here. I'm Andrea Carwell, and I'm a Policy and Advocacy Officer at Domestic Violence New South Wales. One of my portfolio focuses is housing and homelessness, so I thank Homelessness New South Wales for giving me the opportunity to address you all via recording today, and I apologise that I couldn't be there in person. A key part of Domestic Violence New South Wales advocacy priorities is safe and sustainable housing pathways for women, children, and LGBTQI+ people experiencing domestic and family violence. As many of you will well know, for those who attempt to leave the cycle of violence, they are very often met with the systematic problems in housing, particularly when it comes to crisis or temporary accommodation. This in turn will lead victim survivors to make an impossible choice: remain with a violent perpetrator or risk becoming homeless. Temporary and crisis accommodation are available to provide victim survivors with an option to start the process to leave violence. Whilst Domestic Violence New South Wales welcomes the recent changes to the length of temporary accommodation, this can still be a barrier for victim survivors. Domestic violence refuges are stretched to capacity, so appropriate alternative accommodation is often lacking. Some victim survivors are at risk of being placed in the area, or worse, in the same accommodation as the perpetrator, particularly in regional and rural areas where there are limited providers of temporary accommodation. Temporary accommodation is often inadequately sized and resourced, forcing victim survivors and their children to share single-room dwellings. Safe and affordable housing pathways are limited, both in metro and regional areas, so victim survivors find themselves at the mercy of cycling through multiple short-term dwellings. Victim survivors on temporary visas, options are even more limited. They may only have access to refuge dwellings with no further services or housing options. This further strains an already overburdened system, whilst condemning victim survivors to crisis accommodation without any real means to move forward. Some refuges are forced to turn away migrant and refugee victim survivors as they don't have the funding or resources to accept clients that will be forced to stay for longer periods. As we prefaced earlier, with no means to exit the crisis cycle, victim survivors may be forced to return to the perpetrator or live in unstable or unsafe situations, such as in cars or on the street. This can make it incredibly difficult for service providers to support their clients or for victim survivors to access police or ambulance in the event of violence. In areas that are limited in available temporary accommodation, victim survivors may be forced to leave the supportive communities due to lack of available services. Domestic Violence New South Wales has found that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are particularly overrepresented in situations such as these. As Domestic Violence New South Wales has raised in our most recent regional forum and the 2023 submission to the National Housing and Homelessness Plan, the demand for an increase in temporary accommodation and crisis accommodation must be met, particularly in regional and rural areas. Temporary accommodation providers and their staff need to undertake regular quality audits to ensure service delivery is domestic violence and trauma informed. As has already been stressed, safe, affordable and long-term housing options must be established to ease the bottleneck and strain in the temporary accommodation system. Thank you for the opportunity to be involved in this event.
We're so pleased that DV New South Wales was able to join us in spirit and virtually, if not live today. I'm now going to hand over to the authors of the report. So you should be able to see in the chat a link to the report, and that's available on our website. So I encourage you to go away and read the full thing. It's quite an accessible, easy to read document. I think the study authors have done a really great job in pulling together a lot of data. So I'll introduce you to Chris Hartley and Emma Barnes, and they're researchers from University of New South Wales. Thanks, Chris and Emma.
Thanks, Kate. Bear with me while I go through the process of actually setting up our slideshow. Can everyone see that? Yep, all good. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and firstly to acknowledge again the acknowledgement of country, and particularly given the extent that First Nations people both access temporary accommodation and are impacted by many of the features of temporary accommodation. As Kate mentioned, Emma and I were contracted by Homelessness New South Wales to work on this very important piece of research. And it was a piece of research which came together following work from Homelessness New South Wales, DV New South Wales, and Y Foundations to put together some questions to specialist homeless services about the way that the temporary accommodation system was currently working and the ways that could be improved. Emma, I'll hand over to you to go through some of the research methodology.
Thanks, Chris, and hi, everyone. I would like to acknowledge that I am reporting today from Darkinjungland on the Central Coast. So just a quick kind of summary of the research methodology. So the survey was sent out to Homelessness New South Wales members in June 2023. The survey consisted of 12 questions that were focused on if the features of the temporary accommodation system was fit for purpose, whether temporary accommodation is accessible and appropriate, to rate the safety and effectiveness of temporary accommodation options, and if the supply of temporary accommodation was sufficient to meet the demands. So the survey was designed to capture both quantitative and qualitative responses. So following each survey question had an open text to further understand respondents' insights. And there was a total of 237 responses.
Sorry, my screen is completely frozen. I will try and reshare that. My apologies. Okay, for some reason, my PowerPoint is freezing and I can't actually move it through. Let me try and do this without, so you can actually see the notes, but I'll still speak through it. So some context as well, as Dom mentioned, that our report was put together, an interim version of the report was released, and then some quite significant changes were made by the New South Wales Premier and the Minister for Homelessness, which Dom outlined previously. So these really serve as context for some of the report. And even though our recommendations and report was written after this period, it really kind of still informs the content of the report. Emma.
Yeah. Chris, are you able to show the graphs, or do you just want me to go?
Can you see that?
It's still on the research methodology slide.
Apologies, I'm not sure why this is not working. There we go.
Thank you. So just a little bit of demographic information about the respondents. So survey respondents were asked to indicate their primary areas in which their service operated in New South Wales. As shown on the graph in the slide, we can see that 122 operated in regional areas and 103 in metro and 56 in rural areas. It's also important to note that respondents were able to select multiple responses. So most respondents selected only one area, with 77 operating in metro areas, 74 in regional, and 20 in rural areas. Some respondents operated in more than one area, with 40 operating in either a combination of metro and regional or regional and rural. And additionally, 12 also operated in all 3 areas. And as you can see in the graph, there was 19 respondents who operated statewide. In terms of the cohorts that respondents' organisations were servicing, as you can see, we have 184 for coal communities, followed by followed by women with 173, and then young people with 168. Again, respondents could select more than one response. So out of the total respondents, 46 of these were working with only 1 or 2 cohorts, while 209 were working with anywhere between 3 to 7 of the cohorts, and there were 32 survey respondents who worked with all 8 cohorts. So just a quick overview of the structure of the report. So it's broken into 4 sections, as you can see on the screen, and the following slides will present findings from each of those sections.
Given the limited time that we have today, we won't go through each particular section and all the findings and all the recommendations, but we thought we'd give a snapshot of the report. So one of the questions that we asked was the temporary accommodation application process currently fit for purpose? The largest response, we had 104 people said partially, and then followed from that 79% indicated that it currently wasn't fit for purpose. So some of the issues and comments that were made around why it wasn't fit for purpose, there was comments around the prolonged waiting times from Link to Home, that Link to Home and DCJ housing officers often had limited understanding of regional and remote issues, and particularly that the application form for temporary accommodation was challenging and difficult for a whole range of groups, particularly people with low literacy, English as a second language, people with intellectual disabilities and cognitive impairments. In terms of accessing the temporary accommodation system, the next question we asked was, is the temporary accommodation eligibility requirement fit for purpose? Again, a large percentage said partially, so 90 response, 94 said no, it wasn't. Some of the feedback on why it wasn't currently fit for purpose was the impact on restrictive asset caps, which, as you'll note, was one of the changes that was made just after the production of the interim version of the report. So it was great to see some change on that. The restrictive asset cap particularly was found to impact people escaping domestic and family violence. So again, a very important change that was made. One of the other major issues, which we'll also hear from during our panel discussion, was the ineligibility of temporary visa holders.
The survey also asked people if the evidence for temporary accommodation was fit for purpose. So again, we can see that 88 clients believed it was not, while 92 said it was partially. So the reasons for that was excessive evidence requirements, which created an overwhelming experience for both service providers as well as their clients. And respondents really stressed that people who were already in crisis situation found the application process to be confusing and often distressing. The other reason was also the inconsistency in the acceptance of supporting documents. And some respondents had raised concerns around that it was dependent on who at the housing office was reviewing that, depended on what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. The survey also asked respondents to rate on a scale of 1 to 5, so 1 not being good and 5 to being great, if temporary accommodation in their area was able to meet the demand. As we can see in the table here, that most respondents assigned the rating to below 2 for their areas.
We also asked, or the survey asked, how accessible and appropriate is temporary accommodation on a scale of 1 to 5 for a number of different cohorts. So the survey asked for people with pets, people with a disability, people who couldn't attend a housing office during business hours, people exiting institutions, including prisons and hospitals, unaccompanied young people, women and children experiencing violence, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Again, the same kind of ranking was in place. So 5 was excellent, 1 not so good. And there was a variety of different responses, but on the whole, and particularly in the qualitative findings which came out, there was some really strong comments in the way that, particularly around domestic and family violence, but also for people with disability, that there was a current lack of appropriate and accessible temporary accommodation, particularly in regional and remote areas. And some quite powerful stories shared of the impact of that on people with a disability.
Knock, knock. I've come and got the rest of the cardboard, so I'm going out recycling plant.
Okay.
So all that.
Sorry about that. In terms of residing in temporary accommodation, again, with a rating scale of 1 to 5, we asked Homelessness New South Wales members how they saw temporary accommodation in terms of its ability to provide transportation for clients, wraparound support and facilities, and in relation to safety. Again, a lot of the qualitative feedback which came out spoke about often temporary accommodation providers are not safe, particularly for people experiencing domestic and family violence. And as Andrea was talking about in the introduction, that there was a lot of feedback in relation to the housing of people escaping domestic and family violence with either perpetrators or people who are known, and friends and cohorts of the perpetrators, again, particularly in regional and remote locations.
So we have to make it 9 to 9:45. Oh, yeah.
Emma, I think this one is you.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, we also, the survey again asked for another scaling question in terms of 1 to 5 in relation to how trauma-informed as well as flexible was temporary accommodation. As we can see from the results, survey respondents did not consider the temporary accommodation to be trauma-informed or flexible, with rating 1.6 for being trauma-informed out of 5 and 1.7 for flexibility. Qualitative responses from respondents strongly indicated that the current administration of temporary accommodation system lacks trauma-informed approach.
And just on the final actual qualitative thing there, a lot of responses came through really contrasting the system now to the system that happened during the lockdown periods of COVID, and not necessarily expecting the same levels of flexibility necessarily, but that this was a point in time which showed what the system can do, and a real feeling that the system had dropped back to business as usual and wasn't prioritising trauma-informed care. And particularly in relation to trauma-informed, there was a lot of feedback that it wasn't necessarily just considering the training and frontline provision from either Link to Home or DCJ, it was looking at the accommodation system as a whole. Again, harping back in terms of the changes that happened, so our survey was put out before those changes occurred. But as you can see, that in terms of the question of were current time constraints fit for purpose, a significant majority said no. And I think that was a really kind of quite encapsulating qualitative comment which came out in terms of looking at the 28 days and the fact that it wasn't sufficient time for people to be set up and established into more permanent housing options. Emma, is this you?
I think it's you, Chris, sorry.
Sorry. And then looking in terms of exiting out of the temporary accommodation system, we asked how well are people supported from temporary accommodation into longer term. And again, the scale of 1 to 5, with 2 being towards the lower end of the end of the spectrum. The feedback again was that the many specialist homeless services felt that they had to kind of nurse people throughout the system, that people, particularly rough sleepers, were going into temporary accommodation, that they would go through their allocated days, be back on the street, be back in the crisis accommodation system until they could be placed in temporary accommodation again. In terms of the recommendations, kind of realising we're coming towards the end of our presentation, and definitely encourage you to look at the report. There's actually 27 recommendations which look at reforms which could be implemented across the entire system. So some of those recommendations include looking at training programs for DCJ and for Link to Home staff around trauma informed, but also in particularly having a better understanding of accommodation options and issues in relation to accommodation in regional and remote areas. Looking at the allocation of temporary accommodation exclusively to women and children experiencing domestic and family violence. Looking for where evidence and identification can't be produced immediately, which was another major issue which came out in terms of the report, that temporary accommodation could be provided on the basis of initial assessment of an approved SHS or domestic and family violence service. And finally, I wanted to conclude on one of the big recommendations, and a lot of the focus of the report and the qualitative stuff coming out of the report was that the system really needed to revise the limitations and the eligibility on temporary accommodation for people who are not residents of Australia. So that's our quick overview of the report. Again, very much encourage you to read the report and the comprehensive, hopefully comprehensive recommendations that are contained throughout. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Chris and Emma. I know it's no small feat to squeeze, months and hundreds of words worth of research into an overview like that. So we really appreciate those highlights. And one of the things that's stood out really strongly to me in terms of the recommendations is the importance of short, sharp changes to eligibility and process. And we've seen some of that happen already this year, but some of those really big structural and systemic changes that are needed. And of course, so much of that comes back to pathways out of temporary accommodation and into long-term housing. So advocacy around social housing and affordable housing and transitional accommodation is absolutely embedded into the type of work that we're describing today. I'm absolutely delighted to lead into our panel discussion now, and it's a real privilege when we get to share the wisdom and insights from people who are working on the front line, living and breathing this work every day, but perhaps even more importantly, people who have firsthand experience of the temporary accommodation system and moving in and out of our quite complex, hard to navigate homelessness service sector. I'll introduce our panel members one at a time as we work through the next section, but we'll have Rachel, Felicia, Marina and Elaine all speak to us with different perspectives that touch on some of the key issues Chris and Emma have introduced. So our first panel member today is Rachel Natoli. Have you got your, oh, hey, Rachel. Rachel is the founder of the Lockyer Foundation. You're right. Rachel's the founder of the Lockyer Foundation and is also a member of Domestic Violence New South Wales's Lived Expertise Policy Advisory Committee. And Rachel is not only someone with powerful lived experience, but a fierce advocate and leader in these reform spaces. Is your camera on, Rachel? It's okay if it's not, if the tech's not working for you, that's fine, as long as you got your mic on. Can you hear me, Rachel?
I think you're on mute, Rachel.
Oh, it's very glitchy. Rachel, do you mind if I'll skip ahead to Felicia and Marina and we'll see if we can get your tech fixed in the meantime. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, we'll come back to the amazing Rachel and go on to a couple of other really amazing people who we're delighted to have had the chance to connect with recently. And Marina from the Asylum Seekers Centre actually reached out to us recently, just as one of those people advocating non-stop for better access and more rights for asylum seekers in terms of housing and accessing the homelessness service system. So I welcome Felicia Paul and Marina Camareo, who are both from the Asylum Seekers Centre. Do you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Kate.
Would you like to just maybe briefly tell us, in 50 words or less about your service, and then we'll lead into some questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity of joining and also being in conversations with you about this very much needed topic to talk about. So we're delighted to be part of this today, and we hope to just clarify any questions and just shed more light about the issues faced by people seeking asylum. So, Felicia, if you would like to talk a little bit about ASC and the work that we do here.
Okay, we are a community organisation based in Newtown, and we assist people seeking asylum who are living in the community, people who have been released from detention, and we try and just provide a service that includes employment, health, casework, community engagement.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little about the specific challenges that asylum seekers and non-residents more broadly encounter when they're trying to access the temporary accommodation system. So what are some of those challenges or barriers?
Yeah, I think that the first thing to mention is that we could really stay here for hours talking about the challenges and the barriers that are in place at the moment. So I'll try to be as brief as I can. The first thing is the legal circumstances that they're at. So people seeking asylum and also non-residents, they hold a temporary visa. And by that, I mean that they're not permanent residents and they're not citizens. So this is the biggest barrier for them to access not only temporary accommodation, but just mainstream services. So they don't have access to Centrelink. They don't have access to a lot of services that would.
So interesting. This is about government policy for migrants that have no homes to come to, that end up homeless.
Sorry. So yeah, in terms of the legal circumstances, we see different aspects of it. So we see a lot of people who recently arrived to the country and still hold, for example, a visitor visa. And because of that, they can't access the temporary accommodation. And people seeking asylum are just generally not eligible for temporary accommodation. We also see people who have been waiting for an outcome of a visa for 10 or more years. And that really deteriorates their mental health, and it's a huge impact in their lives. So the legal aspect of someone's life is just incredibly huge. In terms of accessing the system itself, there is a huge barrier with accessing Link to Home. So it's always long waits to get through to Link to Home. There is often a misunderstanding of the visa aspect of someone's lives and what it is actually to be seeking asylum. So a person who's seeking asylum is someone who came to Australia seeking safety. They can't stay in the country and they're here, and it's their right to seek safety because of the treaties that Australia has signed. So link to home has a lot of inconsistencies. So it really depends on the person who get on the phone. So there is certainly space for better training to frontline workers and for a better understanding of their policies and perhaps how to deal with people who have been through significant trauma and can't really navigate the system very well. There's also a subtle, but not that subtle, difference between crisis and temporary accommodation. So just this term makes a huge impact on someone accessing accommodation, because people seeking asylum, they are eligible for crisis accommodation, but they're not for temporary accommodation. And when someone calls Link to Home, they just say that they need accommodation, and the response is often that they're not eligible for it. So this is already a huge barrier for people to self-advocate. And it means that we need a worker to contact Link to Home to be able to advocate. It's also important to note that there are in DCJ policies and SHS policies a few exceptions to the ineligibility of people seeking asylum and non-residents. And that is mostly when people have been subjected to domestic violence. But even with that, there is a huge inconsistency. So even if we try to ask for out of guidelines approvals, and it really depends on the person that is on the other side of the phone, which makes the job quite hard, and also for people to not understand what they're entitled to and not entitled to. One thing that is important to know about people who have been subjected to domestic violence is that it's not only important to have a look at what they faced in Australia, but that they fled domestic violence as well. So there is a huge risk that if they're here and they're experiencing homelessness, they might return to the country of origin where they will be at risk of being subjected to domestic violence again. We also see quite a few hospital releases, and because of the challenges in accessing temporary accommodation, sometimes a person will go into crisis accommodation for 1 or 2 nights, and then they will be exited into homelessness. And someone who has been on a mental health ward that has been exited and only just returned to experiencing homelessness and going through all of that again. So during, as Chris was talking about a little bit of how things worked during COVID, this was also a huge impact for organizations such as ASC. So sector organizations received funding, a state government funding from Multicultural New South Wales, and that enabled us to help lots of families, providing weekly financial assistance that would assist with paying for their rent, paying for food, and also preventing or mitigating the risks of them experiencing homelessness. So these funding finished at the beginning of this financial year, so now in July, and it has had an immense impact on people seeking asylum. So we all know that the rental market is horrendous at the moment, so there is a huge crisis. So for them to even pay for their rent is incredibly challenging, and we don't have the resources, and sector organizations don't have the resources of paying for that anymore. So every now and then we would even pay for crisis accommodation for them to be extended and to remain there for longer, but that is now even more limited.
Great. And I guess, sorry to interrupt, Marina, but we need to get on to our 2 other panel members, and I'm mindful that we're nearly at time. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. And yeah, look, I told you Marina is a passionate and fierce advocate, and gosh, she is. And you know,
no, thank you so much, Kate. And I think that was the wraparound indeed. So nothing.
Thanks, Alicia and Marina. Well, we'll go across to Rachel now, whose lovely face I can see there online. Thanks for bearing with the tech problems, Rachel. So, Rachel, do you want to tell us maybe a little bit about your foundation and work, and then we'll talk about temporary accommodation specifically?
Yeah, so to give you a bit of background, as you said, I'm a victim survivor of domestic and family abuse. I was in a physically, sexually, financially and emotionally abusive relationship for almost 8 years with my ex-husband, and I left in 2015 with 2.5-year-old twins. And we ended up from the family home until we managed to find our own place to rent, having 5 different homes over a period of 7 weeks. And basically, I had an amazing caseworker that helped me survive that period, and not just survive, but remind me why I'd left when everything was going wrong and it seemed that it would have been easier to return to that relationship, but was also reminding me where I was heading to, and to keep going, keep putting one foot in front of another. And so I decided to set up my own foundation to provide long-term case management for women and children impacted by domestic and family abuse, so that everybody could have a caseworker like her. And so I set up Lakai in 2016. We opened our doors almost 3 years ago. And we've supported over 150 women and children. And I think for us, Kate, what's most important is our success rate is based on how many of those women and children, how many of those families we're supporting don't return to abuse. And I think our success rate is almost 98%. So I think what it goes to show is if you can, provide that long-term support where they don't feel like we're trying to close them and move them forward quicker than they can manage, and that they know that they can come back no matter what happens, because we know that domestic abuse doesn't finish when we leave. It doesn't end when we leave. There's ongoing systematic abuse, there's ongoing financial abuse, there's ongoing control, especially where there's children involved. If they can come back whenever they need to, then they're much less likely to return to that abusive partner. So to talk about our journey, we left the family home and we were lucky enough to be able to stay with a friend of a friend for a few weeks. They'd just sold a 1-bedroom unit, so the 3 of us moved into there, and we had 3.5 weeks that we were able to stay in that property. We were listed on the safety action meetings, and I want to be very proactive about all the services we work with. It was very early days for the SAM. They just started, and so probably not quite as effective as they are nowadays. But we'd also applied for Start Safely through Housing New South Wales, and we were hopeful that being listed on the SAM would expedite the process of Start Safely. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Also, an anonymous person made false allegations about me having much more money hidden in another country than I had. And so we ended up being homeless. And so we were given, we actually went to the housing office in Maroubra and told them I was homeless, and they gave us some motel accommodation because there was no refuges or shelters available. And so we went in there on a Friday, and on the Monday I was asked to report again. So went back in on the Monday, and they said that there was still nothing available. But as I said, I left with 2.5-year-old twins, and I couldn't feed them in the motel. The motel was clean. It was safe. It was very nice to have clean sheets and clean towels, but it had a kettle, a toaster, and a microwave, and I couldn't cook for 2 children 3 meals a day with those provisions. And so basically I refused to leave the housing office until they found me an alternative. And when crisis accommodation was found for us and we moved into that crisis accommodation, it was at Jewish House. We have a very strong bond and strong relationship with Jewish House now. We work together very closely with clients, but that accommodation had actually been empty since from the following week. So it was available. I don't know why it wasn't coming up to housing, or whether there was an oversight, but I guess what I wanted to say is, first of all, thank you to Chris and Emma for writing the report. It was really interesting to hear, and sad in some ways to hear that the same issues are still coming up, and great to hear from Marina about the same issues that our clients are facing. Obviously much more complex when you dealing with visa issues as well. I think in terms of being grateful for what we have, the fact that The asset cap was raised to 5,000 was a positive. The fact that the initial period of temporary accommodation was raised to 7 days, also a positive. But what can we do to, really help make the system safer and more accessible for women and children that are leaving domestic and family abuse? Well, we've got to talk about the fact that Link to Home is a very slow and arduous process, that the waiting times are ridiculous. Giving people 28 days of temporary accommodation is nowhere near long enough. And I know that it gets extended because we've had clients in there for 50 days, but it is so difficult for them to extend it. And they are given such a hard time when they are not in any state to be looking for any other alternative accommodation. And certainly with the rental crisis, those of us that are working can barely afford our rent. If you're not working and you're dealing with trauma and the many calls and services you have to deal with when you've left an abusive relationship, particularly in that crisis period, you're not able to do that. So I think that we have to be more open to extending that. And I think that after that initial period of 7 days, when people are experiencing domestic and family abuse, especially if they are accessing a support service, we should be extending it by a minimum of 7 days at a time. So why, if we can do it for 7 days in the first place, why can't they just check in once a week? That would be one less thing that they had to worry about, one less call that they had to make. And certainly in terms of being trauma informed, they need a lot more training in the services. We work very, very closely with the housing office at Maroubra, and they are generally exceptional, but that has taken a long time for us to build that relationship and work with them. And their staff are excellent. If they have any issues with our clients, they will come to us rather than that becomes an issue with our clients. And that's what we've found previously. There are other housing officers that I will not name that I will not deal with. And so if our clients accidentally get sent to another housing office, I will beg Maroubra to bring it across, because, and we shouldn't have to do that. We should be able to have those relationships at every other housing office. But some of them are just so appalling and victim blaming. And, for one housing office, again, I won't name, that is not Maroubra, I tried in the last month for 2 weeks, every single day, several times a day to get through. And I gave up in the end. I couldn't get through on the phone lines. I was always last in the queue. It would say you can request a call back. No one ever called back. I think I got through twice. I left a message for a specific person to call me back. No one ever called back. And that's as the CEO of an organization. What hope do you have when you're a victim survivor? And to highlight, I have white privilege. I'm a white female. English is my first language. When I left, I had all those privileges. You take any of those privileges away, even now, education, the color of my skin, the language I speak, the accent I have, all of those things give me a distinct privilege. So you take any of those away and you're automatically at a huge disadvantage. So yeah, we need to do a lot more training to help those staff to be able to deal with those situations.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and what a powerful and incredible perspective to share from personal experiences through to the being the support person for other women and children. And lots of challenges there, but also a real sense of the possibilities, right? And the things it takes to make this a better experience. I know for a fact that our next panel member, Elaine, shares many of those frustrations and passion. And it's been a real delight to speak with Elaine a few times since we started really talking pretty widely about temporary accommodation issues earlier in this year. And Elaine was one of the first people on the email and phone to me to say, hey, the stuff that's going on is impossible for people, particularly in some of the regional and rural and kind of non-metro parts of the state. So Elaine is the coordinator at St Benedict's Community Centre, and we'd love to hear a little bit about your work, Elaine, and perhaps you can go straight into telling us about some of the challenges and the areas of work that are needed to improve experiences in regional and remote areas in particular. Thanks, Elaine.
Thank you. I feel like I'm probably talking to a lot of people who already know a lot of these issues, but it is something I've been doing this work, I have to admit now, for over 20 years in this particular role, for just over 12 years, and I've seen many changes and improvements and things come and go. And I'm old enough to remember when there was refuges and hotels were the backup for refugees rather than the first port of call. So, particularly in regional areas, there is a lack of providers, just a physical lack of providers. In the areas, there's a limited number of hotels that are there. Quite often, they are owned by the same person, so it is hard if it is a temporary accommodation provider. An exclusion 1 means you're excluded virtually from the whole town. The other thing is that providers will always prioritise tourism and other business over people seeking temporary accommodation. And in our part of the world, which is Queanbeyan, which is fairly close to Canberra, there's plenty of other business, and those business providers actually don't need the money from DCJ or SHS providers to make a very good and comfortable living without some of the issues that come with people who are homeless. So that makes life particularly challenging. And I have seen in our town over the years, we've actually lost, literally, the hotels have gone. It's been redeveloped into more expensive housing, petrol stations, anything else but another hotel. So even if we are trying to increase the number of providers, they literally are not there to have to do that. And that priority to tourism means a number of providers over a decade that I've been talking to keep going, we don't need the business, we're doing all right, we can expand and come around it. Also, it means that when there are big events, these hotels, even if they do want our business per se, they are frequently booked out, anything up to 12 months ahead. So even if you get more than your 28 days or 7 days, there are key weekends and months and weeks where there is no hotel accommodation for anything under $1,000 a night for 100 kilometres where I sit. So I can't afford to pay $1,000 a night for any one of the stuff around it. Or if you have got that accommodation, you are asked to leave and there is nowhere else to go in the area. And again, regional remote areas, we face that tyranny of distance. Again, the people who might come from more metro areas, it's not as simple as just jumping on a train or a bus to go to the next suburb, which can be 300-400 kilometres away. If you're using public transport, it can take 24 hours or more to cover 400 or 500 kilometres as the crow flies, because of how the transport works. If you don't have money for petrol for your car, you cannot drive there. So it becomes particularly challenging that even though you might have the security having temporary accommodation for a reasonable amount of time, that you're being told very clearly that you have to leave. Usually on a Friday, usually before Christmas, usually before Easter, usually before school holidays. There is nothing worse than knowing you've got a few days, pack up where you're going to have to move to, could be anywhere else in the state. I wanted to cover the big things. There's a lot of stuff that comes in. It's a lack of diversity of accommodation. I lived out of a motel for 6 months. You're right. It's not easy to live out of. It is very hard to have a sense of home, and different providers have different expectations of what that behaviour is around it. And unless you understand what is causing that, whether it might not necessarily be mental illness, it can be physical illness. It can be the fact that you actually want somebody to visit to drop you off a decent cooked meal and they accuse you having stuff around it. Allegations can be made by providers with sometimes very little proof or understanding of what might be going on and around it. It becomes hard to provide wraparound support services or for people to access stuff around it. with some of the people I might have to go and I'm prepared to go and visit people in hotels, but sometimes in our LGA, that hotel is 150 kilometres, 75 kilometres from where I am, to go and actually see and make sure that person has not only a roof over their head, a friendly face, and access to reasonable food that is appropriate for them becomes an extra part of the challenge when there is a lack of services in those areas, which are hard enough for locals to access, let alone someone else in crisis. Anyone wants to talk to me about it further, please get in contact. I can talk for hours about it. I suspect I can write a good sized library about what I've experienced in the last month, let alone what in the last 12 months.
Thanks so much, Elaine. And thanks to all of our panel members for really giving life to the kinds of issues that are explored in the report. And I hope what we're offering today is a roundup of key issues, a sense of possibilities. But when you go and look at the report, you'll see that throughout the recommendations, they respond to exactly the kinds of issues that Rachel and Marina and Felicia and Elaine have talked about today, and that we know that you're all experiencing. And I would say that across government and non-government, you know, we hear from DCJ that this is tough for them, and you know, and for housing officers knowing that they need to turn people away. You know, we're all people kind of giving it our best shot out there because we care, and it's really hard without some big reforms. But you know, this is our opportunity to do something and have a real collective voice to make some changes. And you know, there won't be any recommendations in the report that will surprise you, because I think we know what needs to be done, but with some collective action and some resources to these issues, you know, there's some real possibility for change. Thank you everyone for your time today. It's been an absolute joy and really motivating and encouraging just to see people's level of interest in these issues over the past 6 months or so, and the many years before that you know, everyone's been talking about temporary accommodation, right? Please stay in touch. We'll have follow-up events and discussions and advocacy in the coming months. So we look forward to talking more about these issues in the new year. If anyone wants to stay online and have a further chat, by all means do so. But thanks everyone, and we look forward to talking more in the new year.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, wonderful panel members. Yeah, it's just such a joy to, well, it's not a joy, right? Like it's awful to hear those distressing stories, but it just always feels like such a privilege from our end to, yeah, to get the real experience. And you know, yeah, everyone's just working their butts off around this stuff, right? Yeah, banging their heads against the same wall.
Thank you.
And
thank you, Kate.
Thanks. Rachel, I think we need you in like every suburb and region, perhaps, right? Can we replicate you?
I mean, Kate, I would love that, but I don't know if you. I don't watch Sky News myself, but I was on Erramolan last week because the federal government have said that from the end of June they wouldn't refund us because we're a pilot service and we're not necessarily providing good value for money. So.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm not the only person who, you know, has a little vomit in my mouth when I hear, you know, the language around pilot programs and, you know, pilots starting and finishing and
about being a pilot program. And I'm like, when you talk about value for money, I don't think saying that you see your clients too often is actually a bad thing. I think if clients are really engaged and wanting to see you regularly, that's a very positive thing.
Yeah.
But yes, don't worry. I intend to not be going anywhere for the time being. So thank you to everyone else on the panel. It's always great to hear from all the other experts in this field and everybody that continues to advocate. It's bloody tiring work, and especially at this time of year, once we've just come out of the 16 days of activism as well. I think all crawling to Christmas and hoping that the heat doesn't take us out before then.
Yep. Yes. And an even more amazing feat to join us today, given that, like, I don't know, sometimes it's like a sprint to the end of the year, and sometimes it's like limping and crawling to the end of the year. I don't know. Thank you. Is there anyone in the audience who wanted to kind of say anything while we're online?
For me, I just want to agree as far as link to home, but I also feel that with the office, what I found is, so I work in the St. George area, so our TA office is Hurstville. So with the TA clients that we get, that client service officer will walk with them till the end. We say for other officers, they go in there. So the main complaints that we get from our TA clients is, because we do men, we do mums and bubs, we do the men, and we do women, young women. So we have different programs going on. So we have a different program for 18 to 25. We have older women, we have the men's site, so they're all individual, and we have a DV site. So most of the TA clients that we have complain that when they're in different areas, that every time they go into housing, they have a different client officer. So one client officer will talk to them about this, their next extension, they get another client officer that's asking them about something else. So it gets quite confusing for them. So I found with working with the Hurstville office is quite good, because they're piloting this, I don't know whether you call it a program or what, where the client officer will stay with the client until they either go into other suitable accommodation, which becomes a lot stressful for the client, because then they don't have to repeat their story over and over again. There's a rapport that's been built, and then you just know that the client, for me, is like, at the beginning of everything, I tell them, don't bullshit me, because that's what I work with at the end of the day. And it doesn't fall on me. It will affect you. I go to bed at night, I sleep, wake up, and I come. I'm here to support you, but just, give it to me straight. I'm not here to judge you or do whatever. I'm here to support you. Yeah. I found that through that sort of direct approach, but it's the way that you say it to them, and also just to give them insight on what Hurstville Housing does. I say, this is your client officer. You have any problems or anything to do with housing, you ask for this person, because they know your story, and they know, what's going on, what's required, and they will tell you. So I found with the clients that we've had thus far, it's been working really good with them.
Great. Yeah. How wonderful to hear about a good example. I think it really reflects what Rachel was saying about that importance of the relationship, right? And yeah, that, how many times do we hear about not only the frustration, but the distress and harm of just having to tell your story over and over again. Yeah, great to hear a good example. Thanks, Sue.
Okay, I've got to go back to work now.
I just
thank you for everything. Thank you, everybody.
Oh, thanks so much. Great to have you here today.
Thank you.
Iana. Hey.
Yeah, hi. Iana Murray, Byron Shire Council. I just wanted to say, firstly, thank you, everybody, for all the wisdom and knowledge and experience in this forum. And it's just really great to see this report with so many regional considerations. I think the experience of accessing TA, obviously in the Byron Shire, we actually don't, we've just got a win's a win. We've got one TA provider on board who is happy to support with single women leaving family and domestic violence with children only. So yeah, I just I'm really grateful to see those regional considerations and so many regional respondents in the report. It's really handy, and I think I remember being on Link to Home numerous times, and trying to support somebody to access TA, which already was, it is an hour's drive from Byron, so it involves leaving. Previously, they would only secure a couple of nights, if that, and the waiting process, when you're trying, even as a worker, to be like, hey guys, we don't have refuges here. We don't have crisis accom. It's not a thing. You're really trying to support. But after our flood disaster here, I actually had a woman leaving a very live and dangerous situation, and there was absolutely nothing in the whole region. And the way that we actually got her to a safe place was I put her in a taxi for 20 minutes to Ballina Airport, where she got a flight to Sydney for a guaranteed of 3 days only.
Oh my goodness.
And, obviously in that situation, there was really that was the best that we could actually do. And, the flood impacts here, we've all, I know it's a shared story across many areas. So, it's just important that we gather this evidence and we keep building this evidence base. And, we have seen wins with the minister making those changes, and hopefully there's more to come. Allaying your point about the diversity that's required, people have different levels of vulnerabilities and complexities and lived experience. So I just think it's so important that we also look at, supported accommodation models and, different ways, because this expectation of behaviour and, particularly for people who, if they hadn't already had, trauma prior to their experience of homelessness, definitely leave with it. So I think, there's a lot to consider, but keep up the good work, everyone, and hang in there over the festive season and stay safe and wonderful. Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
And the regional stuff, we were really, really delighted to get the level of response that we did from regional services. And when you kind of see the issues, I guess it's not surprising that people jumped onto this, because it's at the front of everyone's minds, right? Chris, were you going to say something?
No, just that, echo that. It's really important for us, I think, in doing the work that we're doing, that we're not just kind of capturing one particular voice, but it's, regional or remote, getting working with Marina, particularly in terms of getting perspectives outside of people that aren't Australian citizens, was incredibly important. And just, for me also, I think having such strong feedback from a disability perspective as well was incredibly important, because so often that we frame our systems and don't even think of accessibility. So that was really important.
Just to put a point on that, Chris, there is an increase in disability accommodation, but the demand for again, from a tourism perspective, is outstripping the supply around that comes with it. So I've been aware of a couple of other places that have become suitably disability modified, but again, personal experiences. My husband we have to book a wheelchair accessible room for that. We actually have to book 6 months in advance and pay fully in advance to get to that room. So I don't know how we are going to tap that into for when someone doesn't have their resources and is at the added bonus of becoming homeless in the midst of it all. It's challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, thank you so much, everyone. And let's keep the conversation going, hey? And we'll talk to you all and reconnect in the new year.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely break.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.